ultimately Russia won't go any further if it realizes that the cost of it far outweighs the benefit. The trouble is Putin was hurt with the fall of the Soviet Union, and he's clearly trying to rebuild it. The next thing we're going to see, James, confidently predict, is that when there is a ceasefire, then you're going to have Belarus fall. And at the moment, because Belarus is nothing more than a Russian state, but loosely held by Lukashenko, that most of the people probably believe they're not in a Russian state, but that will be a lot easier for Putin just to take over. And once again, we're seeing another part of the former Soviet Union re-established.
Hello and welcome to Frontline, Times Radio's interview series about the war in Ukraine and global security. I'm James Hansen, and today I'm delighted to be joined by former fighter pilot, military analyst and co-host of the Red Matrix podcast, Sean Bell. Sean, it's always a pleasure. Welcome back to Frontline.
Hey, thanks a lot, James. Thanks for having me.
First of all, I know you have recently returned from a trip to Ukraine. Give us your key takeaways from that visit.
Yeah, I spent a week. It takes 2 days to get in, 2 days to get out. Self-funded, really just to try and improve my understanding of what's going on. We talk a lot about Ukraine, but it's actually there's no replacement being there. Spent 5 days in the capital, Kyiv. Met quite a number of people, a bit of charity work and whatever. I think the first thing you're struck by is Kyiv is a beautiful city, but life goes on. It's not like London in the middle of the Blitz. You know, it's very well protected. It's not really being attacked. The air raid warnings go off regularly, but actually everybody goes about their business. I think the thing that's most poignant again is that you see people looking weary now, talking to people in the streets, chatting to people in the hotel, chatting to colleagues there. A year ago, people were saying, we're going to kick the Russians out. It's just a matter of time. Now, the much greater feeling is just that war weariness. This has got to come to an end. They're paying a fearsome price. And in Maidan Square, which I find really poignant, it's where all the flags are fluttering. They put a flag for everybody who they've lost. And there are literally tens of thousands of these little Ukrainian flags, handwritten notes on them. And, I visit sort of some of the military cemeteries in France, so the very lines of crosses and headstones. And I find that incredibly poignant. You go to the Kyiv and see these flags fluttering. I just sat there for half an hour in the sunshine and just you reflect. It's an awful sort of price that they're paying. So it was brilliant. Went to a military base as well, an air base outside Kyiv. Obviously, I can't share details, but again, as a former fighter pilot myself, the things we took for granted, not only in kit and equipment, but support, electronic warfare, and the like, none of that is available to our Ukrainian colleagues. And it's just quite shocking to see that they have the hardware, but they have no real way of exerting air power over Russia. So very sad in a way.
I mean, that is sadly such an important point that, we've said it many times on Frontline over the years, that whilst we've given the Ukrainians enough not to lose, we have not given them enough to win. And we frankly have not given them what we would have given ourselves if it was us in that situation.
Yeah, and in a way, part of that was sort of came through a bit because as I was sat watching some of these sort of antiques taxiing past me, these are Russian fighter aircraft that former Russian Soviet Union fighter aircraft now in the Ukrainian Air Force. And these are antiques. And they have, they've come from a bygone era. They were my enemy when I was flying in my first tour in the middle of the Cold War. So, the chances of them being able to hold their own in any form of battle. But of course, the West is very nervous about handing Ukraine state-of-the-art technology because they know that there's still some Russian sympathizers in the country, the black market, there's a lot of corruption in the country, and therefore it's quite difficult to guarantee that Western high-tech kit wouldn't fall into the wrong hands. And as a result of that, technology, bluntly, is our asymmetric advantage in the West. We're not going to let that go cheaply. But it's just a stark contrast when you're used to even things like, when I was flying, if you got your flight suit got some oil on it or your gloves got cut slightly on a sharp bit of, you just hand them in and there'd be a ready stock available. Those guys don't have any of that stuff at all. They go home and it gets sewn up. Their flight suits no longer have any anti-fire retardant in them anymore. They're so old and decrepit. So they face a massive fire risk. Things we take for granted, it's just not the case for them.
And that war weariness you described, Sean, I mean, it's obviously completely understandable given we're over 3 years now since the full-scale invasion began. But I wonder to what extent that's down to the reality of the situation on the front line and the incremental advances that the Russians have been making for some time now, and to what extent it's actually now about the fact that Ukraine maybe feels more isolated politically, that America in particular has turned its back on Ukraine.
One of the questions that I went out there armed with was, and went loads of questions trying to do a dip test. And I would say up front, I can't possibly speak for the whole of Ukraine. I was only there for a few days. You can only speak to so many people. But there is no doubt one of the questions was, what do you feel about President Trump? And they're very diplomatic, but pretty quickly they turn around and go, we don't understand how our biggest strategic partner and friend went almost overnight to being our biggest critic, and now dancing with our worst enemy. And I've been, helping commentate on this stuff. I've got a rich background of military history, and I'm stymied. It's very difficult to answer that question for them. They know that they're very heavily dependent on Europe. They know that the UK has been at the forefront of leading some of the European initiatives. We helped get tanks involved with long-range missiles. We were doing flying training for their pilots, even though we didn't operate the F-16, so we couldn't help with that. And there's very definitely this sense that they need partners. I think the overwhelming sense, though, James, is that whilst you and I have talked a bit over the years about the front line, and of course Russia is winning the battle on the front line at the moment. But this, I sense, is less about territory, even though we've obviously made a lot of that and ceding territory to Putin. This is far more, when you walk on the ground, about how on earth do you preserve the security of the rest of Ukraine when, not if, there is some form of ceasefire or peace. Because, the Ukrainians say this is a 300-year war. It's not a 3-year war. They say there's no future in which Russia will recognize an autonomous Ukraine, sovereign borders with its own right of determination. That is not a future that sits remotely in the Russian ambition. So as a result, whatever you give up today, unless you secure the rest of Ukraine, this will be repeated. And that's the thing that they struggle with. How on earth do you, and of course they've had their fingers burnt in the past with written agreements, the Budapest Memo famously of 1994 guaranteeing their sovereignty. And therefore, they know that a written piece of paper won't be enough. It's got to be robust. They've got to have troops. They've got to have alliances. They've got to have a strong military. And that's the bit that I think is causing the biggest sticking point at the moment.
Well, let's come on to that because, of course, these talks have been happening in Saudi Arabia over recent days. Yesterday, we had the news that Russia and Ukraine have agreed to a ceasefire in the Black Sea. Is that in both of their interests, Sean, or does it benefit one side more than the other? I'm thinking primarily of the way that Ukraine has really decimated the Black Sea fleet over recent years. Is it not more in Russia's interest to have that ceasefire?
You're absolutely right, James. I mean, the trouble with all of this is that if you look at it from a military perspective, a ceasefire in the Black Sea really only benefits Vladimir Putin. So why is it happening? Almost certainly because President Trump wants to be able to announce that there is some form of ceasefire, that he is making progress in bringing the war to an end. And he is obviously playing his own game with President Putin, trying to gradually coax him into a wider ceasefire. But focusing initially on that maritime thing, there's a lot of talk that it secures Ukrainian grain exports, and in return, gives access for Russian banks to the SWIFT system that allows them to export, I think it's agriculture and fertilizers. But actually, if you look at it, that sounds like some sort of equitable deal. But first of all, as you say, the Russian Black Sea fleet has been terrorized out of the Black Sea. Also, grain exports, which for a couple of years we were commenting on because Ukraine couldn't export their grain. My understanding is grain exports are up to their pre-war levels already. So there's no benefit for Ukraine in signing this. And what it does do is it not only gives Vladimir Putin a small benefit, but the massive thing it provides is it's an easing of sanctions. It's the first step of taking the foot off the throat of Russia when, it wasn't that many days ago when President Trump was saying if President Putin doesn't sort of shift at all, we'll have to put more sanctions on. So, the whole idea that you're now taking your foot off the throat of Russia, you're easing sanctions, that sounds like a pathway that will only embolden President Putin. Just imagine how delighted he will be that actually he's being brought in from being a pariah to some form of partner, and without actually having to give up very much at all. Now, maybe this is just the first step, and this is part of a grander strategy to get Putin to agree. But bluntly, I'm a military guy. We talked literally about a week or so ago about some ceasefire in the air, that they weren't going to attack each other's energy infrastructure. once again, bluntly, Putin, the one thing that President Zelensky has been able to do to hurt Putin is tack his oil and gas export business. That's what generates revenue. That's what's been hurting President Putin. Therefore, by agreeing to stop targeting energy infrastructure, it actually favors President Putin far more than it does President Zelensky. So all these things really, President Putin is the bad guy. He's the guy who invaded Ukraine at the start of all this, yet here we are offering appeasements to stop Ukraine hurting Russia. That doesn't feel to me like the foundations of a lasting ceasefire.
Even though we have Steve Witkoff, Trump's envoy, the other day, telling Tucker Carlson that Putin's not a bad guy.
Well, again, I'm somewhat confused. When I was trying to explain to Ukrainians what was happening with Trump and this whole line, I stumbled. I just couldn't work out a form of words that could try to explain it. I do think President Trump is infamous for his ability to negotiate business deals, and he's probably got some form of strategy where he's trying to create the environment with President Putin where Putin can actually do a deal. And therefore, you have to find some way of getting closer, offer them inducements. And the one thing that President Trump's been doing a lot over the last few weeks is offering lots of carrots to President Putin, offering, and they've been exchanging gifts. Putin famously gave him a portrait, for God's sake. I'm sure President Trump's got quite enough of those. But I suspect all of this is some weird way, an effort to try to deliver a peace. I mean, famously, President Trump got elected saying, I'll sort this out in a day. As soon as he was elected, it became 100 days. Frankly, the cynic in me says you only get a ceasefire when both sides, either they've ground themselves to a halt and they are in a stalemate on the battlefield, or one side's won and the other side's lost. Neither of those conditions are true at the moment. Why would Russia stop? It's on the front foot. It's winning. The question is, what is it going to? When is it going to stop? What is it going to have achieved? When it's achieved its objectives, then is the time that it can draw stumps. And it's not entirely clear that we're anywhere close to that yet.
I suppose it does raise the question, why has Ukraine agreed to the ceasefire in the Black Sea? Why has it agreed to halt strikes on Russian energy infrastructure if it's not in its own interest? Is it purely because, Sean, they're worried about what Trump may do? They've already seen intelligence sharing stopped, albeit it's now resumed. They've already seen military aid paused, and they don't want to go back to that.
I think you're right, James. I mean, bluntly, President Zelensky knows that he's got to tread very, very carefully at the moment. If he doesn't want to make an enemy of President Trump, that would be folly. And therefore, he's got to go along with it for now. And goodness knows the conversations that happen behind closed doors. But, you must have seen that horrendous sort of episode in the White House where President Zelensky was humiliated. Bluntly, there's not much television I can't watch again, but I just couldn't watch that again. I couldn't, there's so many things in there that to be pilloried for his dress when Winston Churchill in 1943 walked into the White House in his fatigues. And Elon Musk regularly walks around with a T-shirt on and a baseball cap with his kids emptying their noses on the White House desk. I mean, it's quite bizarre. And every other nation in the world puts their arms around President Zelensky, metaphorically and physically, because they see an embattled leader that's going through the ringer as his country is being invaded. To actually see the treatment he got was quite awful. So I do think, in a way, President Zelensky has been encouraged, coerced, forced into stepping into line to following Trump's initiative. But ultimately, President Zelensky is the president of his own country, and he doesn't have to sign up to any peace deal. What he's trying to do is he's got to give Trump a bit of latitude here because otherwise he'll be squeezed out, and he needs America as a friend. He certainly doesn't need America as an enemy.
And I suppose Zelensky's calculation is, look, I need to appear like the more willing of the two parties to agree to a ceasefire and in the end to agree to a lasting peace. I need to be the more cooperative, the more helpful, the more well-intentioned negotiating partner. Do you think, however, that there is any realistic chance that Trump would look at Putin and see him as the obstacle? I mean, clearly that's what Zelensky's hoping, that at some point Trump will switch and go, hang on, I want a peace deal. Zelensky's up for it. Putin's the roadblock here. I need to ramp up the pressure. But we've seen no signs so far of the Americans being willing to ramp up that pressure. Do you think we'll get there?
Well, it's a really interesting question, James, because bluntly, it feels like President Putin is just playing for time at the moment. He's just seeing how far these overtures of friendship are going to extend. I mean, ultimately, President Putin at the last round of negotiations said, if you stop NATO coming to my doorstep, if you stop Ukraine rearming, if you have elections in there, in effect, weakening Ukraine and making it ready for the next bite of the cherry, and you bring me back in from the cold, get me back in the G8, etc. And of course, in effect, it's rewarding him for his aggression. So very difficult to see how that can happen. I think at the moment, what President Trump is doing is simply offering carrots, seeing how far he gets, and he's announcing these ceasefires on the sea, ceasefires in the air, with great pomp and ceremony. It's not entirely clear that if or when they're actually going to come into effect. It's pretty clear they only encourage Putin. And in my opinion, and I think many military analysts, these are not the initial steps of a much broader ceasefire. There's simply an example of how Putin is playing him along. Now, eventually, Trump's ego will get the better of him. He will eventually get frustrated. And the question then is whether his attention just turns to something else, or whether he looks from not just carrots, but sticks. And there are some sticks he can use. And in a way, most of the military experts believe that the only way that Putin is going to be brought into line is through robust action, stand toe-to-toe with him.
Well, yeah, do you want to expand on that, Sean? If Trump did decide, I'm fed up of this, you've been stringing me along, I want a peace deal, Putin's not serious, we need to ramp up the pressure. What are those sticks that America could play?
Well, in short, as we've discussed at the start, Europe has done enough to stop Ukraine losing, but not enough to help it win. The West has orders of magnitude more military capability than Russia has. Simply putting a no-fly zone in place over Ukraine would have minimum risk for the West in terms of bodies, but would create a real nightmare for Russia, and therefore would have to rethink its objectives. And the danger of that is the legacy would be that Russia was stopped. Now, Russia will almost certainly want to end this war on its own terms, in other words, and display it as a victory, not as a young child that's been brought into check by Big Brother or their parents. And I think that's the bit that President Trump could use. I'm not sure whether President Trump has the appetite for that, but I do think European leaders, we saw the military chiefs meeting last week. They were ostensibly looking at the sort of post-war, how do you create a security environment? But there is no doubt in my mind, certainly some of the feedback is that they were also invited to look at what options are available to Europe in order to bolster the security of Ukraine. Because bluntly, if America sort of walks away, which it looks like it is doing metaphorically at the moment, then that weakens Ukraine. A weakened Ukraine makes a more vulnerable Europe. And the question is for Europe then, do we wait until Russia gets to our door, or do we actually take on Russia when it's at its weakest, which is about now? It's been hurting, it's lost a lot of kit and equipment, and it's probably close to the point where it needs to stop anyway. So I think there's some fascinating ways in which the military can be brought to bear, and there will be lots of options put on the table by our military leaders. The question is whether our politicians have the appetite for the risk involved.
That's such a good point, because obviously there are these discussions ongoing about Keir Starmer's idea of a coalition of the willing enforcing a peace in Ukraine after any peace deal. But that could be way off. I mean, we don't know when a peace deal may or may not be agreed. And I wonder if more needs to be done by Ukraine's European allies right now to double down on their support for Kyiv. And I wonder whether, for example, that involves the Germans providing Taurus missiles, whether that involves the British and the French loosening restrictions yet further on where British and French supplied long-range missiles can strike inside Russia. Maybe other stuff as well. What are your thoughts on that, Sean?
Yes, I think there will be a lot of options. One of the tricky bits here, James, is that at the start of the war, there was a lot of talk by the European countries that we would need to ramp up our defence industry so that we could produce enough missiles, bombs, rockets, weapons of war, which bluntly, most of them, like Storm Shadow, you talked about, that was built 30 years ago. The production line stopped. So you need to invest in industry to get those production lines up and running. And although the West said that they were going to do that, literally as months turned to years, there was still no evidence they'd done that, because Europe is, holding a big overdraft. They weren't going to invest in industry and then watch the war end and go, oh, well, we've wasted our money. But actually now the double whammy is, of course, that not only when I was in the military, we never had enough weapons to do what we were asked to do, to then actually give some of the weapons we do have to Ukraine, further diminished our war stocks. And now the double whammy is that Russia looks like it is going to prevail in Ukraine. That enhances their risk to Europe. Also, the security umbrella which we relied on from America looks a little bit more vulnerable. So all of a sudden, the big challenge for the West is going, do we prioritize our own defense and refill our stockpiles and actually just hope that Ukraine can hold out? Or do we focus all our effort into Ukraine and leave ourselves more vulnerable? There's some really profound questions as to where the priority should lie. And I think at the moment, even countries like Poland, who are investing a huge amount now, nearly 5% of GDP in defense, are they going to put soldiers forward into Ukraine to help them? No, because bluntly, history shows that Poland is vulnerable. They will be making sure that their nation is protected. So it's really interesting to see, you've got Italy, they're not going to be involved in any sort of military action, neither is Spain. The big powerhouses, as you say, are Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. But we can't do it alone. But I do think the no-fly zone is the most overt way of engaging with Russia. It minimizes the risk. We don't want to put boots on the ground at this stage. That would be, I did 3 tours, 2 years of my life in Afghanistan, and watched 454 of our soldiers never return home. And that left a profound scar on our country. Those numbers would pale into insignificance if we were to start putting significant forces on the ground into Ukraine. There are other ways in which we could help. And I think air power is one of the key areas of focus.
And do you think we should be looking at doing a no-fly zone right now?
There's an initiative called Sky Shield. I don't know if you've seen it doing the rounds. It's an initiative that looks at how Europe could galvanize around some form of no-fly zone. And it's gaining quite a lot of momentum. The point is, though, it remains a how. It doesn't answer the what and the why questions. What should Europe do and why? And by that, I mean, there are lots of military options available on the table. But bluntly, it's a question of whether the politicians have the appetite. There are still people who are fearful of taking on a nuclear power like Russia. They think it's an escalation. And actually, one of the challenges, I know it's only language, but one of the frustrations from a military perspective is you go, now, hang on a minute, Russia invaded Ukraine. All we should be doing is matching him. When he uses long-range missiles, we're going to match that with long-range missiles. He brought North Korean troops. Why don't we therefore match it? Why are we so nervous about talking about in the form of escalation? Because that plays to President Putin's agenda. All we should be doing is just matching. The world cannot tolerate people using force to take over other countries. Where will it stop if Russia gets away with it? And that's the problem at the moment, is we need to create enough of a robust political intent behind this, because militarily there's lots of options available. We just have to have the chutzpah to use them.
And I suppose now there's the added complication of not just will it lead to escalation with Russia, but how will the Americans react? Donald Trump may not take too kindly to the Europeans imposing a no-fly zone in Ukraine when he's trying to negotiate a ceasefire deal. And who knows, maybe they then stop intelligence sharing once again. Maybe they pause their military aid. Maybe Elon Musk says, well, I'm going to turn off your access to Starlink.
Yeah, I mean, you've touched a sort of a very raw point, I think, which is America's strategy seems to be make sure Ukraine is weak and therefore you can control it in the negotiations. Because bluntly, the war is between Russia and Ukraine. What role does America have in any form of negotiation? What it's doing is it's using its power to coerce President Zelensky to be at the table. But it looks very unlikely that's going to work with President Putin. And therefore, you've got this situation where America does not want to embolden and strengthen Ukraine because that's a threat to Russia, therefore undermines the talks. But Europe is looking at its own national security and doesn't trust President Putin. I think the other issue here is that, Ukraine is 3,000 miles away from America. They've said it's not their focus. Their focus is China. And therefore, just do a peace, stop fighting, put a bow around it. Right, we've done, President Trump can announce success. But that's completely missing this point that actually, if you don't provide that long-range security, all you've actually done is put a sticky plaster over the problem. And it will come back to bite you. Europe knows that. President Trump knows that his age, he's not going to do another term as president. It's not going to come back to bite him. He's brought peace to Europe. Whereas actually it's not. It's not actually solved the problem. And in many ways, it's emboldened President Putin. So you've got this dichotomy that Europe recognizes that long-term security is vital for Ukraine. It doesn't appear that's a priority for America at all.
And of course, the key question, Sean, is how do you ensure that long-term security? I mentioned the idea of a coalition of the willing earlier. Steve Witkoff in that interview with Tucker Carlson appeared to dismiss that notion, but do you think it is a viable option?
It is, but I think you've got to factor time into this as well. Some of the conversation, some in the media has talked about how do you immediately tomorrow, put a force into Ukraine that will stop Russia. I think it's slightly more subtle than that, because Russia has lost a huge amount of materiel, tanks, fighter jets, people. It is probably close to grinding to a halt. Most people believe that Russia's pushing forward in the Donbass because that's its objectives. Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia and Kherson and Crimea. That's the land bridge down. And once they've achieved all of that, and that's why the focus at the moment on Pokrovsk in the region, once they've achieved that, they'll probably pause for breath. So it does appear that Russia is near the end of its tether. It doesn't want to do another round of mobilizations. It can't generate tanks and equipment fast enough at the moment to replace the losses. Why do I say that? It means that for the next 5 years, Russia probably doesn't pose a significant threat to Europe. So in terms of Europe, we don't have to put the most robust military presence into Ukraine. What we've got to do is get our defense industries onto a war footing so that we can refill the stockpiles, get our ammunition sorted out, replenish Ukraine, whilst also putting a framework of military capability in place, and then focus the next 5 years, when we've got this breather, on getting Ukraine's indigenous military capability as robust as it can. We've given them F-16s, but bluntly, they're shooting their own F-16s down because they don't have the training, they don't have the infrastructure, they don't have the doctrine, they're not used to operating this Western kit. Give us 5 years to actually get Ukraine a couple of steps up the ladder of developing their own national capability. Then with every day that goes by, Ukraine gets stronger. The West has got more weapons in its stockpile. The West is more able to offer credible defense. And Russia, therefore, it creates doubt in Russia's mind about would the benefits outweigh the risks. So it's not just about day one.
And do you think that's about it providing an effective deterrent against future aggression from Putin? Or do you think, sadly, he will be back and it's about being ready for when he is?
Well, that's something you've got to get inside Putin's mind, isn't it? And I return to the thesis that most Ukrainians, and I think most military analysts, believe that, Putin sees no future with an autonomous, self-governing Ukraine. And, day one of the war back in February of 22, remember that 40-kilometer convoy and going towards Kyiv and Hostomel airfield, and then reports that the troops were carrying their dress uniforms with them because they just expected to walk into Kyiv, and actually the West thought that probably Ukraine would struggle to withstand the blow. Amazingly, Ukraine did an amazing job, and gradually over the years, the West has gradually stepped up support. But Russia will have learned a lot of lessons from this. At the moment, its economy is on a war footing. It is generating weapons, tanks, military equipment at a pace. And it's also learned lessons from its activities. It knows that Ukraine is using drones very effectively. So now it's putting various protections on its tanks to try and make those less capable. Their soldiers are battle hardened. So I do think it's going to be an interesting conundrum. Ultimately, Russia won't go any further if it realizes that the cost of it far outweighs the benefit. The trouble is Putin was hurt with the fall of the Soviet Union, and he's clearly trying to rebuild it. The next thing we're going to see, James, confidently predict, is that when there is a ceasefire, then you're going to have Belarus fall. And at the moment, because Belarus is nothing more than a Russian state, but loosely held by Lukashenko, that most of the people probably believe they're not in a Russian state, but that will be a lot easier for Putin just to take over. And once again, we're seeing another part of the former Soviet Union re-established.
Sean, we always appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us again on Frontline.
It's a pleasure, James. All the very best.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.